Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to continue our look at perception. So we're going to park and stay with perception for a while, partly because it was such a huge part of cognitive psychology, especially in the early going. It was one of the first big success stories of cognitive psychology. Um, Partly because there is a ton of research that has been done on perception, but also because it's one of those kind of topics that illustrates a lot of the core ideas of cognitive psychology and the core concepts of cognitive psychology. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here while we kind of dissect multiple different aspects and areas of perception. You will notice that most of it, we are going to get into a little bit of auditory perception, but most of it is going to be visual perception. And this also reflects what is done in the research area because visual perception, I would say, accounts for about 80% of perception research. Auditory perception accounts for another 12%, touch perception, maybe another 5%. And then all your other senses get that remaining, I'm going to give myself 3% of research. So we're gonna, if you're wondering, well, are we gonna do touch? Are we gonna do auditory? We're gonna do a little bit of auditory. I don't think we'll get to do too much on touch, but that's just the way that the area is researched, and it's reflective of the kind of work that's done in the area. All right, so again, we are trying to understand using the cognitive psychology techniques this mysterious thing called the human mind that allows us to take in information, process it somehow, and then put out information, behavior, thoughts. And we are dealing with perception. And perception is basically the thing that allows you to interact with your environment. So if we didn't have perception, you might not even know that there's an environment out there, right? So if we couldn't see something out in the external world, we might not know that it exists. If we didn't walk around and bump into things, we might not know that those things were even out there. So perception is how we interact with the world and how we basically plug into it in that sense of being a physical symbol system. This is where we get that designation and interpretation ability is partly because designated through our ability to perceive the world. And then we talked about perception and how it's the experience that we have from the external stimulation of the senses. So we talked about how perception can be true or how it can be incorrect through visual illusions, and how visual illusions oftentimes gives us a lot of information in terms of how our perceptual system is processing that information. And then we ended with a look at top down versus bottom up processing, which used to be a huge debate in terms of whether perception was top down, whether it was bottom up. And as we saw, it's a combination of both. And it really depends on whether you have sufficient information in order to arrive at a perceptual conclusion. So on the left there with the water and the pencil in the glass of water, we saw that that was very resistant to any sort of top down processing, and that's because there's just so much bottom up information telling you that that stick is broken or bent, even though we know from the physics of it that it's actually a straight pencil. And then all the way through Bev Doolittle's Pinto's painting, all the way to Heinz Held Big N, where there was very little information, and most of the perception was done via top-down processes, with many of us not even knowing what we were looking at until the title of the painting was given, which was The Big N. So we're going to continue on with our look at perception today, and we're going to take a look at experience-dependent plasticity, which is a phenomenon that your brain thankfully has, where it can actually change a lot of its wiring because of the experiences that we have. And then we're going to use this to take a critical look and kind of deep dive at face perception. So when we think about the important things that we perceive in this world, one of the big, huge, important stimuli are faces. Other people's faces allow us to identify who an individual is. So we know if somebody is somebody that we know from before, or if it's somebody that we haven't met before. Facial perception very importantly, allows us to communicate emotion in our social interactions. So your facial expressions, you can express the basic emotions of anger, sadness, disgust, surprise, fear, and happiness. So that goes a long way in facilitating social communication. And I talk about this in my learning class, but it is so important that one of the guides that they give managers, bosses, supervisors, people that are in charge of other people is to make sure that your face matches your current emotional state. Because if your face matches your emotional state, then people will know how to interact. If you're angry and you look angry, people will know, well, maybe this is not a good time to interact. If you're happy and you look happy, they will know that, oh, this would be a great time to go up to them and say, hey, how you doing? And start a conversation. The worst people to work for are the ones that are angry and look happy, or happy and look angry. It's when your face doesn't match your emotions. You go up there and then you don't know what you're going to get. Bottom line, facial perception, super, super important. And we're going to take a look at a theory that there is a special area in your brain. One of the few times we're going to go brain, special areas in your brain that is dedicated just to processing faces, just to implementing this facial processing representation or strategy that we have. And we're going to take a look at whether that is because faces are very special stimuli, important for our survival. So evolutionarily, our brains have developed in order to have this area that is specifically for facial perception, or is it just because we're highly trained on facial on faces? So one of the things that you see most often in your day-to-day interactions are faces. So right now I'm looking at about 25 faces. On the way here, I saw a ton of faces. Getting ready this morning, looking in the mirror, I saw a face. So you see faces all the time. Maybe it's just that we were so highly trained on these faces throughout our lifetime. Uh, and we are trained throughout our lifetime. If you think of the one of the things that people do with babies is they will get right up in that baby's face and they'll put their face in that baby's face. And that's one of the things that parents do that, other people do. So you are trained from like day one on faces. Maybe that's why this area of the brain has seems to respond only to faces. It's just that it is for highly trained stimuli, and faces just happen to fall into that category. So we're going to take a look at that. That's going to be what we're going to spend most of the day on. But before we get there, I do want to wrap up attention. So if you recall, we looked at attention about a week ago. And the last thing we need to do is take a look at cognitive number 2, which is spatial cueing. So let's get to that right now. So to refresh your memory for this cog lab, what you're asked to do is you're asked to respond to the appearance of a red square as quickly as possible. So this is another example of a experiment, of a demonstration where scientists are looking at how you are processing information and making guesses, making theories about how you're processing information based on your reaction time. So much like if you remember the train example, the two trains traveling towards each other and the bird flying in between it, much like the distance representation strategy would take forever to solve that problem, but the time representation strategy takes very little time to solve that problem. In the same way, you can make theories that predict whether certain situations should be faster in reaction time than other situations, and whether they are or are not gives you insight into how our mind works. So in this case, you were asked to respond as quickly as you could to the appearance of a red square. It was either going to appear to the left or to the right of a fixation point. During each trial, you were asked to keep your eyes focused on the center and avoid moving your eyes. So you have to fight your kind of instincts a little bit. You were asked to focus on that center fixation point. And even when the red square appeared, you were asked to still maintain your focus on that point. So don't move your eyes one way or the other. You were asked to basically try to stay fixated on that point and use your attention in your field of view to locate that red square. So as soon as the square pops up, you press detected it, and then you would start the next trial. And there were three conditions in this experiment. It was neutral, valid, and invalid. And in the neutral condition, what would happen is that center cross would change, and it would change into just a line. So in the neutral condition, this was a condition where there was no arrow, there was nothing to indicate where that red square was about to appear. However, in the valid condition and in the invalid condition, you did get an arrow, either pointing to the left or pointing to the right. And in the valid condition, the stimulus, that red square, appeared where the arrow pointed. So the valid condition was telling you the truth. It was saying, you know, the square is going to come onto the left, and then the square appeared in the left-hand position or left side. But the invalid condition, the stimulus did not appear where the arrow pointed. So the arrow pointed to the left, then all of a sudden the stimulus appeared on the right. And then the last thing that we have to set up here is that in order to make the valid condition something that you would actually pay attention to in order to make the valid condition, sorry, or the arrow, something that gave you information where you would want to adopt a strategy where you use that arrow for directing your attention. 80% of the trials with arrows were valid trials. So 80% of the time that arrow was telling you the truth, and only 20% were invalid. 20% of the time the arrow was not telling you the truth. All right, so what did these look like? Well, we had a neutral condition. So in the neutral condition, you saw this display, you're fixating on that plus in the center of the screen. You got a straight line that had no arrow on it, so no indication of where the red square is going to appear. And then the red square appears, you hit detect it, and that was one trial in the neutral condition. In the valid condition, we again have our center fixation, but this time we have an arrow, and this arrow is pointing to the right. And in the valid condition, that's where the square appeared. So you hit detected it, and that was the end of a valid trial. And then in the invalid condition, this is the line condition, you had a center fixation point. Again, you were looking at the center fixation point. When the arrow appeared, you were still looking at that center, so you're still looking at the arrow. But in this case, the arrow was pointing to the left, and the red square appeared on the right, and that was the invalid condition. All right, so those are the three conditions. What were the results? What happened in this cog lab? So here we have a graph. We're going to pop up the results in just a moment. On the y-axis here, we have reaction time. So basically, the taller the bar on the y-axis, the longer you took in that condition to detect the red square. So this is how long did it take for you to press that button that said, yep, detected it. That's the reaction time that's on the y-axis. On the x-axis there, we have the three conditions. We have the neutral condition, no arrow. We have the valid condition, the arrow is telling you the truth. And then we have the invalid condition, the arrow is lying to you. So the neutral condition is kind of the control condition here. And we can see that we have about 0.35 milliseconds. Say that again. We have about 360 milliseconds. That's about 1/3 of a second. So in about 1/3 of a second, you're able to detect that red square as being either on the left or the right. What happens when your attention gets sent to the wrong place? What happens when you have a condition where the arrow is lying to you? Well, that's the invalid condition. And as you can see, it takes you time. It takes you more time to locate the red square to indicate, yes, I do see it in that invalid condition when you've been pointed in the wrong direction. And then what if we've been pointing in the right direction? Well, in that case, we have a much quicker response time. So when the arrow is pointing in the correct location, you are much quicker to notice that, that red square. Now, one thing that I will point out here for anybody that might be unimpressed with these numbers. So if you take a look at the actual numbers that we have here, the actual reaction times, the best condition, that valid condition, that's 340 milliseconds. The worst condition, the invalid condition, is about 375 milliseconds. That's only 35 milliseconds difference. That's only 3%. No, that's 0.3% of a second is the difference between those two. So sometimes it's easy to look at these results and say, well, is it really that big a difference? Is it really that important of a difference? But the bottom line, especially for cognitive psychologists that are trying to figure out how your mind works, differences like this is exactly what we're looking for. Because differences like this tell us how your mind is working. And while it might not have big implications when you're looking at a red square, it can have, as we're going to see later on, big implications for how you interact with the world. So never get mixed up between small, minor little effects, milliseconds here, milliseconds there in the lab. It's what it tells us about how our mind works. That's the important thing. What are the strategies that we're using? And then once we know those strategies, you take those out of the lab and you say, all right, if this is, we've discovered in the lab how our mind works, what does this now mean for the real world? So to sum this up, basically you are much faster in the valid condition, or you are significantly faster. I'll use the technical statistical term. You are faster in the valid condition, and you are slower in the invalid condition. And that is the main finding that we have here. When you get cued in the wrong direction, it takes you longer to correct and find that red square. When you're cued in the correct direction, you find that red square much more quickly. All right. So we kind of gave a description of what has occurred. So right now we'll open this up and basically make it explicit in terms of why you're faster in the valid condition and worse or slower in the invalid condition. And the hint to this is what was being moved to the cued location. Because if you did this according to the instructions, your eyes were not being moved to the cued location. You were keeping your eyes dead center. So something must have been moved to the cued location. So what is it that was moved to the location that the arrow pointed to? Your attention. Exactly. So this is a excellent example of how your attention usually follows where you're looking, but it can also be placed in the periphery of where you're looking and also be spread out amongst a wider visual area. So in this case, your attention was what was being moved to that cued location. And we have that in the valid condition. Makes sense because when that arrow pointed to the right, your attention was moved to that right location, which means that you were processing that location already. You were already dedicating serial parallel processing streams to that particular location. So when that red square popped up there, it was very quickly processed and you were able to respond with a very short reaction time. However, in the invalid condition, the arrow sent you to the left side, which meant that you were dedicating your attentional resources to processing the left side, which means that when that square popped up on the right side, you basically had to move your attention back to the other side in order to process the red square to the point where you can say, yes, I detected it. So that difference, those 35 milliseconds difference between the valid and the invalid conditions, that's basically the amount of time that it took you, your mind, to move your attention from that incorrect location back over to the correct location to the point where you could process it and say, yes, I can see a square there. All right, so what type of attention is driving this effect? I'll give you a hint. There is an endogenous part of this, and there's an exogenous part of this. So part of what was going on was endogenous attention, that is attention that is generated from inside of you. It's goal-directed attention. Part of what was going on in this was exogenous attention, attention that came from the stimulus itself. So any idea which part was which? Mhm. Well, you were close on the endogenous being the valid. So what part of the endogenous, what part of the valid one is endogenous attention? Exactly. So more precise would be to say that the endogenous part of this was the arrow. So the arrow told you where to go. It might tell you to go to the wrong place, right? So there was that invalid condition as well. But basically, the arrow provided you with an internal goal. And there is nothing about an arrow, there's nothing stimulus based about arrows that makes you look in the direction of the arrow. In fact, that's something that you need to learn as you learn about arrows and learn about them as a symbol. But basically, they communicate a goal. Arrow points to the left, and then you say, "Oh, okay. I guess I'm going to move my attention to the left." You move your attention to the left. That's goal driven. That's endogenous. What part of the what part of this demo was exogenous? Then? What had the ability to just grab your attention? Yep. The neutral one. I'm sorry. What? Well, the neutral one wouldn't have had endogenous attention. But what part of the neutral one specifically would have grabbed your attention? Let's say that you didn't read the instructions to this cog lab and you had no idea what it was that you were supposed to do. So you had no goal whatsoever. What part of the cog lab would be something that would just grab your attention on its own? The square. So the square that pops up, that's exogenous. So that is just something, the appearance of a red square, it's very salient. It's the only thing that's in color. It appears, so you have that aspect of, we didn't really touch on this, but things that pop out of nowhere grab your attention because it's part of how motion works, and motion is something that grabs your attention. So this red square was just something that grabbed your attention. And even if you were told nothing about this cog lab, you would still sit there and be like, oh my gosh, there's a red square, because just by its very nature, it grabs your attention. So can anybody think about how we can take this out of the lab, some applications that this might have, some implications that it might have for our interaction with the world at large? Okay, and how would that, I guess, yeah, so that's a really good application of the endogenous versus exogenous. So the fact that we have, stoplights, the fact that they're lights, the way that they're designed, the fact that they change, right? The fact all of these things can help to grab your attention in an exogenous way. You add on top of that endogenous goals that we have when we learn how to drive, such as you need to pay attention to the stoplight, you need to pay attention to these road signals. Both of those work to basically keep us safe and keep us able to navigate through an intersection. Now, one thing that could kind of bring this into a spatial cueing type of situation would be the training that we do to not be distracted when we are approaching certain high attention needed areas of the road. So, for example, the one thing that you do not want to do when you're going through an intersection or as you're approaching an intersection is start paying attention to other things. And if something were to grab your attention, let's say that, much like it happened to me one day, not at a stop, not at an intersection, but basically I rear-ended in my earlier years, I rear-ended a person that was driving in front of me. And it wasn't going very quickly because we were in a higher traffic area, and I got distracted by a protest that was going on outside of the school. So I was paying attention, I was doing my endogenous goal-directed behavior. We were moving slowly, so nothing was really grabbing my attention motion-wise. But then all of a sudden, I saw this protest to the side of me, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is that? And then my mind said, hey, you know what, that's very interesting, but that's not my goal right now, because my goal is driving. But when I got distracted by that invalid stimulus, by the time I brought myself back, I had rear-ended the person in front of me. And it was a whole big thing because not only was it a rental car, but I also did not have my wallet because I was driving to retrieve my wallet. So it was just a whole bunch of stuff all together at once. All right, so that's one possible implication in application. I have one that I set up, and I'll show it to you. One of the professions that uses this spatial cueing, valid, invalid, condition difference is magic. So magic tricks basically have built themselves on the premise of drawing your attention to an invalid location, basically saying, look over here, while the real action is going on somewhere else. So I mentioned this is an important example for two reasons. Number one, it's a really nice illustration of endogenous versus exogenous attention, and also the invalid versus valid cues, and that whole idea of moving your attention to one place and then trying to move it back. But I also mentioned it because we are very blessed to have one of the foremost magic researchers in the world here in our psychology department. So Dr. Ladd is one of the leading researchers in the field of the psychology of magic. So I just want to give that a plug. So if you find this stuff kind of interesting and you think to yourself, you know what, I really want to dive deeper into that and maybe take a look at the psychology of magic, just right upstairs, Dr. Ladd has a very, very prominent lab in that, and we are very lucky to have him here. But we're not going to see Dr. Ladd perform magic. He's actually really, really good. But we are going to take a look at some professional magicians. We're going to take a look at Penn and Teller as they try to use spatial cueing to do a magic trick.
Ladies and gentlemen, Penn and Teller! Oh my God! Nice to see you, buddy. Pleasure to see you. Thank you again. Welcome back to the show. First of all, I want to congratulate you on, you guys are the longest running headlining act in Las Vegas.
In history.
In
Not
history.
just now, the longest running headliner in history in Las Vegas.
Congratulations, that's just amazing.
And we just signed for another 4 years, so till 2022.
At the Rio.
We intend to die in office. That's our plan.
Oh, man, I can't believe I love that. Now, let's talk about the 5th season, Penn and Teller Fool Us. Explain the show to people if they haven't seen the show. It's a good premise.
Greatest magician in the world, and as we're into the 5th season, it really is the world. Get people from all over. They come on and they do a magic trick that they think can fool us. Yep. And if they can fool us, they come out and play with us in Vegas at our theater, the conveniently named Penn and Teller Theater. And if they don't, they go away crying.
Yeah, exactly.
And this season, we're also bringing back, which is not thrilling us, we're bringing back people who fooled us before. Fan favorites to come back on and try to fool us again. Yeah,
okay, now you always bring a cool thing or do something amazing, some type of illusion or trick, and so you're doing something tonight. I never know what it is.
Yeah, we didn't let you in on the rehearsal. But
no, I never know. All right, good.
What do I do? Yeah, stay right over there.
Okay.
We're going to watch it right there.
Okay.
You know, there's a word, misdirection, that's used by lay people a lot. It's a magical term. It's a term of art. And the way lay people use it is wrong, because lay people often use it as a synonym for distraction. Like, hey, look over there, do something sneaky here, and then you look back and the trick's done. That doesn't fool anyone. Mm-hmm. The way we use the word misdirection is kind of a curating of attention, giving the audience a story that can tell themselves that lets them not really know they were distracted. We're going to do a trick right now using misdirection. I'm going to tell you what it is. The trick is the vanishing chicken. There's a chicken in there, we're going to make it disappear. Now, when I say give you a story to tell yourself, it's not some jive-ass story like this is Clucky McCluckface and this is the chicken coop rocket ship to Mars. No, a real story, which is you know it's a vanishing chicken. I've told you that.
Yes.
You know we're Penn and Teller. you know we do magic tricks. So as soon as I cover up this chicken, you're telling yourself what you're going to do. You're telling yourself a story. You're making yourself a promise. Because you're promising yourself right now that at no time will you allow your attention.
Oh my goodness.
Misdirection. Now,
Yeah.
Jimmy, I want to see how well this works. Can we have the house lights up so I can see people? Yeah, just want to see. Show of hands. How many of you saw the gorilla with the cymbals? Should be everyone. It's a goddamn gorilla with cymbals. Should be all of you.
Yes,
Good.
yes.
Now, subset of that, how many of you saw Teller walk out here, cop the chicken, and split? That's almost everyone, too. Now, here's where the misdirection comes in. How many of you, during all of that, saw sneak the gorilla into the cage? How many people saw that? Because that's
What?
misdirection.
Oh my
right
God.
there. That's Georgie Bernassett who works with us. Georgie
Gosh,
Bernassett.
are you kidding me? Oh my gosh. That is
Only we would take a showgirl and put her in a gorilla
in a
outfit.
gorilla outfit. Unbelievable right there. Penn and Teller. How did you do that? Penn and Teller Fool Us premieres Monday at 8 p.m. on the CW. You guys are the best. We'll be right back. How?
All right, so that's a great example of spatial cueing. Don't ask me what the real invalid cue was, or the real invalid condition was, because they basically covered it up with layer upon layer of things. But they also mentioned things like, you're in a magic trick. So you're going to tell yourself certain things. You're going to tell yourself, like, I'm going to pay attention to this one particular area. They're not going to fool me, and I'm going to make sure that I don't divert my eyes from what they're doing. And that's all endogenous attention. Again, you have this goal. You don't want to be fooled, but again, it's magic, so I don't want to be fooled. And again, Dr. Ladd would know more about that. But you're telling yourself, okay, I'm going to figure this out. That's your goal. So you put your attention into certain areas. And then you have stuff like exogenous cues, such as the gorilla with the symbol, such as when Teller came out and seemed to take the chicken away. So these are things that, well, again, you didn't even have to know you were in a magic trick. Those would have grabbed your attention. And again, this is basically one of the ways that spatial cueing is used in this very kind of specialized skill to make sure that you are directing your attention where they need you to direct it. And then that gives them the time, because again, it's extra time before you can get your attention back. That gives them the time that they need in order to do whatever manipulations will allow them to perform the magic trick. All right, so that is the application to magic. And we're going to talk about one more application, because even though I love magic, I don't do magic, and I don't go to that many magic shows. So it's not a huge percentage of my life. But just to kind of get people's brains thinking about this, or sorry, minds thinking about this, one of the places you always want to try to take the situation that you have in the experiment and extrapolate it to the real world. So you say to yourself, all right, in the experiment, I was moving my attention from place to place. And in the experiment, people were telling me, or the cues were telling me to look over here, when in reality, I should have been looking somewhere else. And then you start asking yourself, in my real life, in the real world, what are times when I am trying to move my attention from place to place? I want to attend to this instead of attending to this. And what are times when people are cueing me and saying, hey, this is really important. But in reality, at least for your situation, it might not be important. And you might then miss something that is actually important, because it takes longer for your attention to come back to. If you haven't guessed already, one of the things I'm talking about is just the news. The news these days and people's use of the news, and I'm going to say this without getting too political, but people's use of the news is taking advantage of this spatial cueing phenomenon. It's taking the advantage of the fact that moving our attention can be goal directed, but it takes time and it takes effort. And moving it back to where it's supposed to go takes time and it takes effort. So a lot of times you'll see things like a very important issue. So we, as citizens of this world, we're interested in issues that are important. issues that are going to impact our lives, issues that could make our world better or worse. So you have an important issue, and it's over there. And you have this world, and you're trying to find where that important issue is. You're trying to find where is this thing that I need to pay attention to. And somebody says, hey, you know what? Look over there. That's where you need to pay attention to. And if lo and behold, that is an honest news program, if that is a news program that has done their work, has done their due diligence, and is curating the news and not just reporting on everything because they have a 24-hour news cycle to fill, but they are actually curating the news and they say, hey, look, that's important. We're going to focus on that. And it's right there. That's an important issue that you will be able to process well, and you will be able to process thoroughly, because you don't have to put in the extra attention, the extra effort to move your attention to that location. And you're not going to miss it because you're looking at something else. And it takes time to move yourself back to that area where that important issue is. On the other hand, when there's an important issue that you need to pay attention to, that's important to your life, and then somebody says, the media says, hey, look over there, and you look over that other direction, and the important issue does not appear in that particular area, you're basically being distracted by other information, invalid location, invalid information, things that are not actually important. And why this is important is because it then requires you to move your attention back. It then requires you to put information to get back to be able to find that other important issue, which takes effort, which takes time. And if you look up theories about the new attention economy that we are currently in, where there are so many things that are vying for our attention, there is such a long tail to the content that is out there that it is not like it was before when there were 3 channels and the nightly news came on once at 6 and then once at 11, and that was it. We are not in a position where we have a lot of attention to spare, a lot of attentional resources that we just have lying around. So in this state that we're in, where our attention is constantly being grabbed for, and the effort that it takes is monumental in terms of moving our attention to the correct locations, something like this can have huge effects on our ability to locate important information and process important information to the point that we need to in order to be effective in interacting with our environment. All right, so any other possible applications or observations for spatial cueing? Okay, so we're going to put a pin in that now. That is the end of our look at attention. We are now going to turn back to our look at perception, and we're going to end today's class with a look at faces, deep dive into facial perception, and answer the question, or at least start to answer the question of whether they are a special stimuli or whether they are highly trained. And this whole thing came up because of 2 kind of discoveries, 2 phenomenon. The first one is experience-dependent plasticity. And experience-dependent plasticity is the mechanism by which your actual brain structure. So this is one of the few times we're going to talk about the brain. We're going out of the second level of Mars tri-level hypothesis, representational level. We're going into the implementation level. This is a good time to point out that sometimes the implementational level can inform your representational level. So it's not like a 1, 2, 3 order that you need to go into. Sometimes you start solving level 3 implementation and it lets you know about representation. This is one of those instances, but it's the mechanism by which your brain is actually changed by experience. So one study that has been done has taken a look at the difference between the brains of novice chess players versus the brains of expert chess players. So chess is something that can be learned. Chess is something that has certain rules, and you gain experience and you can move up the ranks and become an expert. And what they found was that if you took a look at novices' brains who, just started playing chess, if you take a look at those two areas that are circled, that's what the activation in those areas looks like by a novice. So the gray is less activation, the white areas are more activation. That's what those areas look like in a novice. That's what they look like in an expert. So an expert's brain has actually been rewired through this experience-dependent plasticity so that more of that area that is in white there, that SMG and PMTG, Dr. Rodriguez is here, I'm sure he would tell me exactly what those two areas are called. But that SMG area and PMTG area, those areas went through experience-dependent plasticity and actually changed what they were being used for. So in this area here, in this novice, it's not like the novice isn't using those areas of their brain, right? You use 100% of your brain every single day. I'm sure you all know about that fallacy, but we only use 10% of our brain. And if we could somehow tap into the other 90%, we turn into Lucy from the Scarlett Johansson movie. Not true. We use 100% of our brain, just not all at once, which is a blessing, because if you use 100% of your motor cortex all at once, it's called having a seizure, and that's not good. You don't want to use your whole brain all at once. But we don't have areas of the brain that we ignore. We don't have areas of the brain that we don't use. That novice is using that area of their brain. They're just not using it for chess. Through experience-dependent plasticity, playing thousands upon thousands of chess games, that area of your brain gets rewired and it becomes a chess area. And that's one of the first building blocks of our discussion on whether faces are special stimuli or highly trained. Because in this case, those areas, they're not chess areas when the brain starts out, but after being highly trained, those areas turn into chess areas. All right, so why do we mention this? Well, the second block of this conundrum, this mystery that we're looking at, is what happens or what is the second part is what's going on with the fusiform gyrus. So this area over here. So this fusiform gyrus is also known as the fusiform face area. And it's an area in your human temporal lobe that seems to be specialized to respond to faces. So when they have done fMRI studies, when they have done brain activation studies, they have showed people variety of objects, variety of stimuli, and this area seems to only respond to faces, facial stimuli, just responds to faces. So the question that they started asking is, well, is this an area that is just specialized for faces? Much like we have a visual cortex that's just specialized for visual information, we have a somatosensory cortex that's just specialized for touch. Is this an area that is just specialized for faces, which would then indicate that we must have representational strategies in our mind that are specifically just for faces? So is this just for faces, or is it just for trained stimuli? Is it much like the chess area where the fusiform gyrus is that FFA, the fusiform face area, is not actually a fusiform face area, it's a fusiform highly trained stimulus area, and faces just happen to be one of the most highly trained stimuli that we experience. So this was something that was coming up as a debate. So part of the research, part of the things that started this research back in 1997 was the article by Ken Wisher et al. And she basically provided evidence that when you take a look at the activation in the brain, a lot of information going on here. We just got to concentrate on this one little area here. So if you take a look at areas of the brain where faces are more activated than objects are, it's in that fusiform face area. It's that yellow area there indicating a greater activation. So basically what they would do is they would show you faces, they would show you objects, they would subtract the activation of your brain under faces versus the activation of your brain under objects, and that's what's left over, indicating that that is a special place that is used when you're processing faces. Same study basically found that this area is activated when you compare faces to objects, when you compare intact faces to scrambled faces. So that middle left one, intact faces to scrambled faces. Top right, when you compare faces to objects. Middle right, when you compare 3/4 faces to hands, so it's not just straight on faces, it's actually hands as well. So basically, they ran a whole bunch of different conditions and said, let's compare faces to other things. And in just about every single situation, faces came out as activating that fusiform face area a lot, whereas all other things did not activate them very much. So that seems to suggest that this is a specialized place for faces. This fusiform face area, this fusiform gyrus, specialized brain area that is hardwired, pre-wired to help you recognize faces. So you don't change it through experience-dependent plasticity. It's just made like that from the jump. All right. Then other research started coming up that basically said, well, maybe not. Maybe it's actually just for highly trained stimuli. So Gautier et al. Back in 2000, they showed that this fusiform face area, this fusiform gyrus, also got activated for cars and for birds, but only by cars for car experts and only for birds by bird experts. So for this one, we're going to take a look at these brain scans here. So we have the fusiform face area. That top row, that's a car expert. That bottom row, that's a bird expert. And you can see when they're looking at faces, that left column, that's how it is when they're looking at faces versus objects. And you can see for the car expert, we got extra activation in that fusiform face area. For the bird expert, we got extra activation in that fusiform face area. So they are processing faces in that fusiform gyrus. However, when you show them stimuli that they are experts in, that fusiform face area also activates, but not vice versa. So when you take a look at cars, for the car expert, when they are shown cars, that fusiform face area lights up. But when you show cars to birds, experts, or I guess birds just in general as well, wouldn't have this activation. But when you show cars to bird experts, that area does not light up. And it's not just because bird experts don't have a very active fusiform face area, because when you show birds to car experts, we get no activation. But when you show birds to bird experts, we get a lot of activation in the fusiform face area. So this would be evidence that it's not just for faces, it's not just for human faces, it's actually something that is for highly trained stimuli. And if you do enough training through experience-dependent plasticity, you will be able to use that fusiform face area to perceive those other specialized stimuli. All right, and then the one that we're going to, the study that we're going to sit and take a look at in a little bit of detail right now, because this was a follow-up study, actually not a follow-up study, but this was a study that kind of set all this off, and it's got one of the greatest stimuli names ever. So this is also by Gautier, and they took a look at whether or not this face area can increase with expertise when you're looking at novel objects. So one of the problems about recruiting car experts, one of the problems about recruiting bird experts, is that maybe because their fusiform face area is more plastic, maybe it's different than a typical other individual, and that's why some people can become car experts and other people don't. And maybe it's something weird about the fusiform face area that allows bird experts to become bird experts where other people don't. Right? So maybe it was something that was different about their brains that allowed them to become these car experts and bird experts. The way that you answer that question is you say, all right, we're going to take typical people and we're going to train them on a stimuli they've never seen before. We're going to train them until they're experts and we're going to see what happens with their face area. So what they did is they created stimuli called greebles. And greebles are these little entities, and they come from 5 families. They come from the Semar family, the Osmit, the Galmi, the Radok, and the Tassio, and they have 2 genders. You're either a plot greeble or your glip greeble. And a person or a greeble from the Samar family with the Plock gender, that's an example of a Plock Samar greeble. And you can also have a Plock Osmic greeble, that's what they look like. And you can have a Plock Galley greeble, so they look like Plock Radic, Plock Tasio. And then you can have the other gender, glip, from the same families. So the Samar family, but a glip looks like this. So we got Plock at the top, we got glip at the bottom. And we can do that for all the other 4 families. And these are only single instances of these greebles from each family. So they would make hundreds of these variations that belong following some rule, following some communicated to the participants rule about who goes into what family. And it would be up to the participant to become an expert by seeing if they can learn how to identify these greebles. So no joke, this is what a typical experiment trial would consist of. They would show you this and they would say, all right, what's that greeble? And you think to yourself, okay, that's a glyptosio. And they would be like, no, sorry, that's a glyperatic. Be like, well, all right. And then they say, all right, what's this one? And you'd be like, okay, that's a Plock Samar. And they'd be like, no, that's a Plocktasio. Be like, all right, I can get it, I can get this. And you would do this after trial, after trial, after trial, after trial, after trial. And what they found was that eventually you would get to this and it would be like, what's this? And you'd be like, that's a glip galley. I know glip galleys when I see one, and that definitely is a glip galley. And they'd be like, yeah, absolutely. What's this one? That's a Plocktasio. What's this one? That's a glyperatic. And you would just be like, bang, 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 greeble, greeble, greeble. You would know their family, you would know their gender. You would become an expert at identifying greebles. So you were able to become an expert at identifying greebles. What did that do to your fusiform gyrus? Specifically, what did that do to your fusiform face area? So before training, they scanned these individuals' brains and their brain activation when they were looking at greebles versus not looking at greebles. I think it was greebles versus faces. But anyways, they were looking at what was their activation when they were looking at greebles. And in the beginning, there was little response to greebles in the fusiform face area. So if you took a look at, this would be regular objects. So if you took a look at the activation of faces compared to objects, that fusiform face area there on the left there, that's faces, your activation when you're looking at faces, that fusiform face area lit up again. Lit up and lots of activation in there. You're looking at faces, lots of activation in the fusiform face area. When they were shown greebles at the beginning of the experiment, before training, when they were novices at identifying greebles, that's what their fusiform activation was like. And if we take a look at that in graph form, you take a look at the fusiform response, higher bars indicate greater activation. You take a look at faces. Faces had a large activation before training. You take a look at greebles. Greebles, not so much activation before training. Very small response in the fusiform face. So that's to be expected because these greebles were not faces. What happened though after training? So after training, lo and behold, there was a large response to greebles in that fusiform face area. Large response in that fusiform gyrus. And this response is actually comparable to the face response. So if we take a look at their responses once again before training, so here we have face activation before training, and then on the right, greeble activation before training. That's the activation before training. That's the activation in the fusiform face area after training. So if you take a look just at the side of the greebles, you can see that there is now the beginnings of extra activation in the fusiform face area. The activation has increased, evidence of experience-dependent plasticity. That area is now being rewired so that it can also process greebles. So we have before training, once again, the activation of the faces much greater than activation of the greebles. After training, activation of the faces comparable to the activation of the greebles. If you do a little side-by-side comparison, you can see that training on those greebles increased the activation in that fusiform face area to the stimuli that is the greebles. So once you become an expert in greebles, now all of a sudden you can see your fusiform face area is processed. Yep.
Why did response lower rates after?
That is a very good question. I don't know the exact answer to that, but if I had to guess, I think it's more an artifact of how these are measured rather than an actual absolute decrease in the activation.
Would it be possible that the plasticity took away from the face training to put more of a section of the brain to be able to identify and do as well? So you have to lose some of the facial response as you grow your response.
That is that's the darker possibility of these two. So that is a possibility that in rewiring that area for your so that it can be used for greebles, you have now lost a little bit of your ability on actual facial perception. I would just, I mean, I'm not, I will just say right now, I don't know what the actual answer is to that, but it is a very, very rare circumstance where learning something makes you lose something else. So I don't know very many examples of where learning something new makes you actually lose abilities that you've had before. I mean, if you need to dedicate practice time to developing a new skill, yeah, your old skills that you don't practice very much anymore, you'll lose their abilities. That's just how practice works. You only have 24 hours in a day. It's different than when you're trying to learn something new. So there are effects in interference when you're trying to learn something new, which is why people will tell you never try to learn two languages at the same time. If you're trying to learn French and you're trying to learn Spanish at the same time, whatever you learn in Spanish is going to interfere with your French learning. Whatever you learn in French is going to interfere with your Spanish learning. But yeah, I mean, it's quite possible that these people, after being trained on greebles, are now walking around with lower ability to do facial perception. It's quite possible that people with card experts and bird experts are actually worse at identifying facial people faces. But I would just, by not having heard any research on this, because it does seem like a horrible thing, and also not to discourage students from learning new things because you're worried that you're going to lose something else that I'm pretty sure almost never happens. So I would say, again, I would err on the side, or I would bet on the side of this is an artifact of the way that fMRIs and CAT scans are measured rather than an actual decrease in the ability. The other possibility, if it actually is a change in how you're processing, is that one of the things that is interesting about brain activation is that the more a certain area of the brain is being activated, the more it's being used. However, the more something a brain is being used, an area of the brain is being used, the less efficient that brain area is. So you can imagine that when you're really struggling with something, when you're really struggling to learn something, whatever that brain area is, that brain area has got neurons firing all over the place because it's taking a lot of activation, it's taking a lot of energy in order to process this information that you're trying to process, right? That's why learning is tiring, right? That's why learning is something that is willful and effortful. And that's also why sometimes when you get an expert that comes by and they take a look at a problem and they solve it, they're like, oh yeah, boom, it's done. Part of that could be because their area of the brain is wired better through this experience-dependent plasticity. So it could be that both in greebles and in faces overall, the processing in that fusiform face area has actually gotten better. The connections are better, they're more efficient. So instead of needing 100 units of activation now to process faces and greebles, you need less. Right? You actually can get away with only 60 units of processing in that area. That's a more hopeful it's a more hopeful outcome. All right. But yeah, I mean, it's good to think about these possibilities because that's where the next generation of ideas will come from. All right, so the conclusion from these Greeble studies, what they concluded was that your fusiform face area, it responds to faces. So that was never in doubt. Everybody agrees. Fusiform face area responds to faces. But they say that it responds to complex stimuli as well. So when you become a Greeble expert, fusiform face area now responds to Greebles. And that's why cars get responded to by car experts, but not bird experts. Birds get responded to by bird experts, but not car experts. Basically, that fusiform facial area is for faces, and anything else that's complex that you are highly trained on will also be processed in that area. All right, so we're gonna wrap up with just a look at some of the challenges to these conclusions. Does anybody have any challenges that they can think about for either the Greeble results or the cars or the birds that would argue against the idea that they're just complex stimuli? All right, so I'll give you a hint and we'll kind of start on this. One of the things that occurred to me when I was looking at the Greebles, when I was first processing these studies, is that some of the Greebles, they actually look like faces. So they actually have a structure that lends itself very closely to a structured face. So if you take a look at a Greeble here, you might not be able to see a face. But if you take a look at a Greeble, you put googly eyes on it so that you know where it's at. Now all of a sudden, that looks like a face. That looks like a nose or a beak. That looks like a mouth. That looks like hair coming out of the top of it. And there are a lot of Greebles where if you do this, you'll be like, oh yeah, that looks like a thing with a face. Right? That looks like something that I can recognize a face with. So it could be that rather than rewiring your fusiform face area so that you can respond to Greebles because they're now this new kind of highly trained stimuli, it's quite possible that all you're doing is you're learning to see faces in Greebles. And then that is what is allowing you to gain expertise. And then because you're seeing faces, that is now being processed by your fusiform face area. That could be the reason why that area is active. Yes. Yeah, they do. They do. And that's exactly the other criticism for the bird experts and the car experts. So if we take a look at the car experts, cars have faces and they have facial expressions. So if you take a look at this car here, it doesn't take too much to basically say, well, okay, well, those are kind of the eyes, got a nose there, and it's got a mouth, and it's happy. Right? That is a happy car. And if you start to think about that, you take a look at other cars, you might not have noticed this. Some people have, some people haven't. But you might just be like, okay, well, yeah, this car looks happy. Right? That is a happy looking car. This car, on the other hand, is anxious. Right? That is a worried looking car. And I can hear, the reactions. Most of you are not confused at this point. Most of you are not looking at this stimuli going, I don't get it. What do you mean that there's a car face there? So we see it. And maybe it could be that when you become a car expert, you basically learn to see and recognize the faces in the car. So rather than rewiring your fusiform face area so that it now responds to cars, you're strategizing how you look at cars to basically hijack your fusiform face area by recognizing the faces in cars and using that extra area to allow you to become this expert in cars. So once you start seeing faces in cars, you almost can't stop. So you might look at this one and say, well, where exactly is the face? But when you see it, right? So it might not be the entire hood, right? That's why maybe they're car experts, because it takes some time to find that face. So this is something, I mean, it has its own, I think, subreddit post at the very least, where somebody drew basically what the faces look like for all of these, different cars. And if you were a car expert, you could, just like we re-represented the train problem from a distance problem to a time problem, and all of a sudden we became experts at solving trains and birds flying between trains. It could be that car experts re-strategize how they look at cars to basically say they're like faces. And once you learn that, you basically have this entire area of your brain that you didn't use before to understand cars and recognize cars, that you can now hijack for that purpose, turning you into that car expert. So it's not rewiring the fusiform face area, it's just accessing it for this particular stimuli because it looks like faces. Same thing with the birds. So birds, even more than cars, have faces. I mean, they literally have faces. And I don't know what this bird's actual emotional state is. I am not entirely sure how it's feeling, but it looks annoyed. Right? That bird does not look like it's having a good time. This owl looks like it thinks it's better than you. Right? It might not. Right? It might be thinking, "Wow, I really love this person," but your brain, your mind has processed this and said, "Yeah, that owl looks like it's better than you. This bird here looks like it's seeing a wasp for the first time. This bird here looks like it can't believe I called out those other birds on, on their facial expressions." So birds have faces. And maybe when you become a bird expert and you're able to identify, and I should have put these birds in my notes, but you're able to identify every single species of bird, is because you basically hijack your fusiform face area to be able to treat these bird faces as faces, and that's where the expertise comes from. And the reason that this is so possible and so much a possibility in terms of what's going on with the fusiform face area is because there is a phenomenon called pareidolia, I believe it is. Yeah, pareidolia, might be pronouncing that wrong, where we are programmed hard to perceive faces just about anywhere. And if you start looking, you will see faces. So here we got faces in candle holders, and they look terrifying. That a burning candle is going to be placed into their mouth. We got a viewing device, a telescope here that looks happy that you're about to use it. You got a faucet that looks worried that maybe you didn't turn it off. Right? We have a chair that is very, very pleased at the idea that somebody's going to sit on it. This one, I mean, I think this is just human experience, part of human experience. Electrical sockets look worried, right? They look shocked and surprised. So this is just something that our minds do. It takes stimuli and turns them into faces, processes them faces. And if you see a face, your fusiform face area is lighting up. That's what seeing a face indicates. And these happen everywhere. This is one of my favorites. Look at that pot. This is just a pot on a regular stove. You got yourself a face right there. This is a box that got thrown out. And this box has seen better days, right? This box has fallen on hard times. This one here, this one was USB is best waifu. And again, like they're everywhere. There was a study that was done in the lab where I did my postdoc, where basically all you need is two dark areas and one dark area underneath it in between, and you will see faces. So electrical outlets that are horrified that their companion got hooked up to virtual reality, right? It's there, you can see it. And if you see it, your fusiform face area is activating. And these can be anywhere. So I'll zoom in on this one a little bit. Hands up if you see the face. Basically hands up if your fusiform face area is activated. If you haven't seen it yet, you got the eye right there, nose is right there, top lip, bottom lip, and there's your face. And faces are everywhere. And we'll end on this this and then a conclusion. I love Iggy Pop, partly because he's David Bowie adjacent. So I'm kind of conflicted in putting on this one, but just to show you that faces can end up anywhere. There's Iggy Pop in concert. Sad torso is sad. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And hopefully this one will be burned into your memory so that you will remember this this lecture years from now. But basically, stimuli, faces are almost perceived everywhere where there's just stimuli, where there's two of something and one of something underneath it. So again, the challenge is to kind of put a pin in this. If you want to show one way or the other, fusiform face area is for faces only or for highly trained stimuli. If you want to show that it's for faces only, you need to show that it responds to faces, which has been shown, that it responds to some sort of untrained faces, faces that you are not trained on. So something like, the only thing I could think of was the interracial identification phenomenon, where we are experts at identifying individuals of our own race, but we are not very good at identifying individuals from other races. And you would need to show that the fusiform face area does not respond to trained complex objects that lack faceness. So you can't do greebles. Greebles have that idea of faceness. You need trained stimuli that don't have faceness. So if you could show chess experts, when they're looking at a chess board, identifies the fusiform face area, that would be a potential example of something that is complex that does not have faces. And if you want to show that the fusiform face area is just for complex stimuli, you need to show that it responds to trained complex stimuli, again, that lack faceness. If you can achieve that, then we have a much better way of understanding and including whether it's special or trained, whether it's for complex stimuli or for spaces specifically. All right, at the wire, I did it. So that is it for today. So we will continue our look at perception next time. Again, it's a huge topic, but other than that, we are done for the day.